Good evening, ladies as well as gentlemen. Papa Boris here, playing some more chess. I wanted to show you another game by underrated world chess champion Max Euwe. This one is jumping forward in time to 1957 when he played against Bobby Fischer. Now, Bobby Fischer is a man who doesn't really need much introduction. He was one of the greatest chess players of all time. Personally, I think that debates about who was the greatest chess player of all time are stupid. That being said, I do think Bobby Fischer was probably the greatest chess player of all time if you measure greatness primarily on the proportion between what the person was able to achieve relative to how little support they had to achieve it. And Fischer certainly was the most dominant player ever relative to how little support he had. Basically, his own brain, his obsession with chess, and some old Soviet magazines was all he had, and with that, he pretty much took over the world. This game is interesting because when it was played, Euwe was way past his prime. He was 55 years old here, if my math and Wikipedia are correct, whereas Fischer was before his prime. If the chessgames.com database is correct, and if Wikipedia is correct, this game was actually played on Fischer's birthday when he turned 14 years old. So we have someone who's old and hasn't really been at the top of the game for about a couple of decades, and then we have someone who's young and wasn't really going to come into his prime until the mid-60s or so. But even at this point, though Fischer was only 14, clearly he was a prodigy and was destined to go places in chess. And so it takes some balls of steel, especially if you're an older gentleman, to play against this guy. So let's see how Euwe did it. He played d4, so going for, in this game, the queen's gambit, not the king's gambit, like in his younger days. And Euwe decides just to keep things simple, exchange in the center, and then play bishop to g5. This is known as the positional variation, and black plays bishop to g4, so both players have pinned each other's respective knights. Euwe proceeds with e3, supporting his center, and Fischer says h6, basically putting a question to white's bishop, what do you want to do with it? Euwe decides to keep the pin on, and then Fischer attacks in the center with c5. After Euwe develops his bishop naturally, to d3, Fischer plays knight to c6 behind the pawn. And then we have this knight to e2 move. It's a tricky move to make. A lot of new players, a lot of casual players will just play knight to f3. That is the most logical square for the knight in many ways. But on e2, the knight has some functions. It is supporting d4. It's supporting this knight on c3 to prevent any kind of pawn structure damage from a bishop capture on c3. And also, if black does decide to get obnoxious putting a bishop on g4, the pin is much easier to deal with if you can just press f3 to get rid of it. Fischer here decides to simplify. He exchanges in the center, and then he castles, and then Euwe castles as well. So a very calm, peaceful, open, normal position. It's kind of hard to believe that in 9 moves this game will be over, and one of these two players will have absolutely smashed the other. So how did that happen? Well, Fischer plays bishop to e6, which makes enough sense. It develops the bishop and adds a little bit of support to this isolated pawn on d5. Interesting thing about this opening is that both players get this isolated d-pawn, so that can be a potential weakness and strength for both of them. And now we see a really interesting move from Euwe, and this is a very instructive move, I think. This is the move that the engine recommends, so it's definitely a deep move on the part of the old Dutch grandmaster. He plays bishop to c2. It's one of those moves that once you see it, makes a lot of sense, but it's just, maybe hard to think of it if you're not a really deep player. The thing about this move is, first of all, it gives a little bit of support to the d-pawn by unveiling the white queen's protection of it. And the other idea is that the white queen could get to this d3 square, and then if it's behind if it's in front of the bishop, then the queen can maybe in some cases threaten checkmate on h7. Of course, something will need to be done about this knight on f6, but there is still this bishop here ready to capture that at a moment's notice. Notice, too, that black has his knight on c6, not d7, so this potential is increased. Here, Fischer decides to play bishop to e7, which is a little bit passive, and it's at this point that the engine thinks that Fischer's starting to lose the thread of the game. Perhaps a better move would have simply been to develop the rook along the open e-file, which is where rooks want to go. Moving this bishop a second time just to break this pin isn't really worth it in this case. Euwe's like, okay, whatever, I don't care about you breaking the pin, I'm just going to move on with my own plans, and plays knight to f4. Not only is knight on f4 not only is f4 a strong outpost for the knight, but exchanging the knight for this bishop on e6 could be good, and it could also be weakening to black's position if this f-pawn were to move to recapture the bishop. For example, just in theory, if this knight on c3 Maneuvered back and up, it could land on g6 and cause some problems for black. It could also threaten this backwards e6 pawn. So all in all, it's kind of uncomfortable. Notice that if black had here just gone rook to e8, then knight to f4 isn't quite as big of a deal, because here black can actually play g5 and fork white's pieces, and then after the exchange, simply recapture with the rook, and then the bishop moves. So that's useful to have this rook on e8 capturing on e6, and that lets the f-pawn stay where it is. Whereas the way that Fischer played it, going going bishop to e7 after knight to f4, this bishop's actually in the way of the rook's ability to protect the bishop on e6. And I have to give some credit, because you do have to have some balls of steel as Euwe to play a move like knight f4 versus a prodigy like Fischer, who's just a year ago played the game of the century and beat up, wadded into a ball, and wiped the floor with one of America's best grandmasters. Because you have to take into account the possibility of bishop to g4 attacking the queen, and then afterwards playing g5 to fork white's pieces. But here white could play f3, and then after the bishop moves somewhere, like c8, then white could drop the bishop back into this f2 square, where it's nice, protecting d4, and we still get to have this knight outpost on f4. So I just wanted to say that because there has been talk. My favorite chess player of my childhood, Joachim, was quite mean when writing about Euwe, saying that Euwe didn't have the spirit or the fortitude to become a true chess champion. But, you know, moves like knight f4 are a little bit daring, if nothing else, especially for a 55-year-old to make, because there's always this threat of the double attack on white's pieces. Okay, so here Bobby Fischer decides not to play g5. It doesn't actually win a piece. Bishop g4 doesn't win a piece. And in any case, g5 really weakens the black king position with all these pieces focused at it and the white queen ready to jump in at a moment's notice. So he went for an alternate plan. He made what I think could be called a Fischer move, queen to b6. One thing that you'll notice in a lot of Fischer's games is the tendency to make very simple-looking, very direct moves where he just moves a piece and attack stuff. Like from here, the queen is attacking d4 and b2. The problem is that in order for such moves to work, you need to have a very solid position to be able to have the freedom to go and attack your opponent's stuff. This is like a Fischer move before Fischer really came into his own, because here it's actually a game-losing mistake. After this, Euwe ignores the threats on his pawns and simply captures on f6. And now it's like, what the hell do you even do as black? Do you take back with the g-pawn? That seems terrible, because you have this horrible pawn structure, the white queen's ready to jump in at any moment, and the black king just absolutely has no safety. Fischer's king position in this case would be held together with prayers and popsicle sticks. So Fischer does the other option, bishop to f6, but now we have the simple queen to d3. So the protector on f6 is gone, white is threatening checkmate on h7, and you have to make a move like g6 to protect against it. But then, of course, white can just play knight to e6, and then after the pawn takes, white just goes here, and it's just horrible for black. Not only is white up a pawn here, but black's king safety is completely shattered. White can go queen to h7 and toss the king around. White can even pick up another pawn on e6 if he wants. I mean, white can just do whatever, and he's completely winning the game. So Fischer decided not to go for the move g6. It is worth noting that was probably his best defense, although this is still like a very, very disadvantaged position for black, and a player of Euwe's caliber could probably have converted it into a win. Black's best chance for a defense was to play g6, and after knight to e6, find this resource knight to b4. And so here, Euwe could have maybe found a very sharp line, knight takes d5, and now white can still come away with an edge. If black takes the queen, then white takes the queen, and notice that both of white's knights are attacking both of black's rooks. So no matter how you let the smoke clear, you know, at the end of the day, white is gonna be up a rook in this endgame. So as black, you probably aren't gonna want to take the queen. What you can do is take the knight here, and now allow Euwe to win the exchange. However, the nice thing about this is it's not like, you know, like a totally open and shut case. Yes, white is up the exchange. Yes, white is up a pawn, but this pawn is a little bit soft here on d4, and maybe black would have some chances. At the very least, the game would have continued. But instead of any of this, instead of playing g6 and then countering the knight capture on e6 with knight to b4, Fischer decided to just make a break for it and play rook f to d8. So the idea here is very simple, that if white goes check and the king goes here, this square was vacated by the rook. Then if white makes another check, then the king can run out. However, white could have gone queen to h7 and still won this game. At this point, the position is completely hopeless, but Euwe decided to go for a slower approach, playing rook 8 e1. And this idea is very straightforward. The rook wants to be on this e-file to cut off the black king's attempts at escape. Now, the thing is that the most precise way to play this would have been to go queen h7 first, let the king go to f8, and then play the rook to the e-file. The move order of going the rook here first allows black one more shot of going to g6, although this is still winning for white after knight takes bishop. So once again, Fischer didn't play that. He decided to lose in a different way. He played knight to b4. And this move has a double attack on white's queen and bishop, but it's like a move too late because now white can get in there on h7 with check before black takes the bishop. And after king to f8, there are a variety of options for white to win the game, but Euwe chose a pretty stunning one, and I was really impressed by this move. It's a just ingeniously quiet move. He played a3, which when I first saw it, I was like, what the heck is up with this move? Like, why are you attacking the knight? The knight wants to take the bishop on c2, so what's the idea? Well, the idea is that Euwe doesn't care about the bishop anymore. The only thing this bishop was doing was letting the queen get into h7. The reason for a3 was to kick the knight from b4, because on b4, this knight had a very important function. It was guarding d5. And now Euwe plays knight c takes d5, and at this point, the game is officially over. It's move 19. So Euwe here, even at the age of 55, absolutely smashed one of the greatest players who had ever lived. Of course, before that player came into his prime, but still, at the age of 14, Fischer was already known to be a prodigy and, you know, had beaten up some grandmasters in a stunning style and was clearly going to be a great chess player. And 19 moves into the game, it's all over. So what's going on here? Well, the knight on d5 is attacking the queen on b6. But if the queen moves, then queen to h8 is checkmate, because the other thing the knight is doing is guarding the e7 square and preventing the black king from escaping. So black has two choices, either lose the queen or get checkmated. Fischer decided to make one more move for absolutely no reason. He could have resigned here, but I guess just to make sure the game hit at least move 20, he played rook takes d5, but then knight takes d5, and it's the exact same situation. Either you move the queen and get checkmated, or you stop from getting checkmated and lose the queen. And you might be thinking, but Boris, why don't you just take the knight? What's up with just taking the knight with the bishop? Well, but that's the purpose of this move, rook to e1. Now the rook blasts open the e-file. The bishop was blocking the rook's view of the e7 square, and when the bishop leaves, the queen to h8 is still checkmate. So I hope you enjoyed this game, and I also hope that I've done my penance. I've spent, you know, decades of my life hating Max Euwe for absolutely no rational reason, and I hope I can bring a little bit of recognition to the world's least respected chess champion. I will see you guys again soon. Please like and or subscribe, and I'll be back with some more chess.